Hello, everybody. Welcome to ARC PDX. I'm Wesley Ogle, and ARC PDX is on the road this morning. We are at Lone Wolf Watering Holes right here in South Portland. We are just a few blocks away from the ICE facility, which has been the home of those months-long protests, which have ramped up since President Donald Trump announced the deployment of National Guard troops here to Portland. So this morning, we are diving into how this is impacting the immediate area, and we're digging into the contrast of the peaceful protests during the day and how things get more tense and, yes, sometimes violent in the evening. A pivotal hearing for the state of Oregon, or state of Oregon's attempt to stop the National Guard troops from deploying to Portland, is set to go on as scheduled this morning. It comes after a federal judge originally on the case recused himself at the Justice Department's request. The Trump administration had claimed that Judge Michael Simon should not be on the case because he's married to Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici. She has publicly spoken out against the deployment. Yesterday, Judge Simon stepped back. The case has been randomly reassigned to Judge Karen Immergut, who was appointed by President Donald Trump during his first term. The state is calling for a temporary restraining order and argues that there is no rebellion and that the president's action is government overreach. Meanwhile, the Trump administration argues that the protests or the acts of violence at ICE facilities that directly inhibit the execution of laws constitutes a form of rebellion. In a June 7th memo, the White House said that violent protests were threatening agents who were just trying to do their job. This came during protests in Los Angeles. The memo also cited a need to protect federal property. The Portland memo mentions that original directive and says the Guard will be here to protect property where protests are occurring or are likely to occur. We are on the road this morning for ARC. We're talking to local and state leaders ahead of the deployment of troops to Portland. So joining us now live this morning is Senator Jeff Merkley. Senator, thank you so much for joining us for ARC PDX.
Great to be with you.
So now that the judge in the TRO hearing today recused himself, what does this mean for this case? And does that change how you expect this hearing to go today?
No, not at all. It shouldn't have any impact. Whenever there is a potential conflict of interest, in this case, the federal government said, hey, there may be some bias because you're married to a member of Congress. And the judge said, you're right, there might be some bias, so I'll step aside. And I'm not saying he is biased, but recognizes the potential perception of conflict of interest. That's exactly what judges are supposed to do in a situation. For example, let's say they're hearing a case that involves a company, but they own stock in that company. Well, it would be appropriate for them to step aside. And it just means another judge it's assigned to, and that other judge, I'm sure, will do a fine job.
So what if the state's temporary restraining order request is not granted today? What happens next? What will you be paying attention to?
Well, it'll hopefully be appealed if it's allowed to be, but that's sometimes not possible when you lose a temporary restraining order. I must say that I want people to understand that to call up and federalize Oregon National Guard without the permission of the governor requires establishing that there is either an invasion or a rebellion. And in the kind of the definition that was established when these laws were written, a rebellion meant that you had a violent, armed, organized group that is against the government as a whole and is threatening the overthrow of the government. That is clearly not what is happening here. So I do hope the district judge says the test is not met. But there's a lot of discretion given to a president of the United States, and for that reason, we don't know where the judge will come out. May say it's dubious, but the president has discretion, so I'm not going to give a temporary restraining order and just bump it up to another court. But I really hope that there's a profound line, a red line against using military troops against people demonstrating in the United States of America. And they're used often against people who are peacefully demonstrating, and to be able to raise your voice and say, I disagree with the policy, that's all American as apple pie. That's not a rebellion against the government as a whole.
So President Trump, I mean, as you've been hearing, is calling Portland a hellscape, a nightmare, a war zone. What's your response to him?
You know, he said, maybe I've been watching the wrong tapes. And yeah, President, probably you have been watching tapes from 2020 when there was a tremendous conflict, and that conflict was actually amplified by the president Trump during his first term, sending out federal agents who did not wear any sort of personal identifier. And so you didn't even know if they had legal authority to stop people, and they were grabbing people off the street and throwing them into unmarked vans. Unmarked police throwing people into unmarked vans is a symbol of an authoritarian or even a fascist state. And that's why I've introduced legislation saying that every agent has to be identifiable either by a number or by a name and what unit they represent, so people know that they actually have authority to be where they are. But what Trump is trying to do is to create conflict and then use that conflict to expand authoritarian powers. We are in a very dangerous moment now, the most dangerous moment for our Constitution since the Civil War. And so I'm encouraging everyone, don't play his game. He wants a violent interaction to increase his authoritarian power. So don't give it to him. Don't take the bait.
Do you happen to have an updated timeline on when troops could be on the ground here in Portland?
As of last night, I was told it could be as early as Saturday and as late as next Wednesday. The number of days of training that were planned were 3 to 5 days of training. And though, of course, that could change. Everything's kind of by the seat of its pants type of operation here. So that's the best we have. Could be tomorrow, and it could be the middle of next week.
So what is your message to the National Guard troops who are being deployed? What are you wanting to tell them?
The most important thing is never touch a peaceful protester. What we saw in 2020, you might remember the video of the Navy veteran who's standing there, and the federal agents run up and start clubbing him. If my memory's right, they broke a bone, they knocked him to the ground. It was horrific. And multiple things happened like that, like a person was shot in the head, a peaceful protester. I don't know if it was a rubber bullet, but it fractured his skull. And those stories of attacks on peaceful protesters just boil the blood of everyone who loves our Constitution, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of protest. That is what it's about in government of, by, and for the people. The people have a chance to make their views known. So do not, no matter what your instructions are, do not touch a peaceful protester. If an arrest is occurring because somebody is violent, well, then that's something that actually should be taken care of by local police. In fact, that's the point here. So there is, first, nothing that constitutes a rebellion that would justify the federalization of these troops. Second of all, it is very important that they not play a role of contributing to a cycle of violence.
So, you know, if you're saying that you're not seeing what Donald Trump is saying is happening out here, and you're not seeing a rebellion, then why do you think President Trump is sending troops here and is putting so much attention on Portland?
Well, a couple things. One is he wants to distract from other things. Prices are going up on health care. And of course, that's because of this, what he called his big, beautiful bill. That's a big, ugly betrayal. And those prices are going to be shocking people in November when they review. And that's why we have a government shutdown. The Republicans want to sustain this savage attack on Americans' health care. And second of all, his tariffs are driving up prices on all kinds of things, groceries. His energy policies are driving up the price of utilities. He wants to distract from all that. And he has this authoritarian impulse. People ask, is it possible he'll declare an emergency in other ways that might affect the next election? And 6 months ago, I said, no, I just can't imagine that happening. Now people can imagine it happening because he's used emergency powers, including what he's doing right now with the federalization of the Oregon National Guard, in ways that break all the boundaries and make absurd the interpretation of terms that are in the law, terms like rebellion. And realize what he said to the generals. He said, I'm giving you a loyalty test. You don't like what I'm doing? Walk out of this room. You'll lose your rank and your career. Like, you have to be loyal to me, not to the Constitution, but to me. And then he proceeded to say that some of you will be sent to organize the militarization, occupation of cities as a training ground, as training. Well, training for what? Training for further deployment of the military in the future to suppress dissent. And why does he anticipate dissent? Because he's pursuing an authoritarian agenda. breaking due process, breaking and attacking freedom of speech, breaking freedom of assembly, breaking freedom of the press. All of these are incredibly un-American assaults on our liberties, and he anticipates dissent, and he wants the ability to use the military domestically to address it.
I want to hear a little bit more about that legislation that you were just talking about introducing. Part of it is making sure that federal officers are identifying who they are and who they're with. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and the timeline of that, and if that you really think could actually get passed?
Well, I'm asking for a vote on it, on the Defense Authorization Act, and we'll see. Republicans have the ability to veto the ability for any amendment to be voted on. But I'm basically saying if any amendments are voted on, this has to be one of them. Would it pass? Maybe. I mean, it should be concern of Republicans as well as Democrats not to have unmarked individuals that you don't even know if they have any legitimate role on the street grabbing you during a protest. And how are you supposed to respond? Is this person really an officer or not an officer? Are they just kidnapping you? Or are they just maybe somebody from the opposite side of the political spectrum who wants to issue you orders, and they have no right to do so because they have no ID about, and it doesn't have to be their name, by the way. The administration keeps saying, well, we don't want ID on people because they might be doxxed. That is, people might protest them individually. Well, put a number on them, a number or a name and a unit, so we know that they're legitimate, and the folks that they're approaching and issuing instructions to know they're legitimate.
You know, something I've heard people talk about too down here is about the location of the ICE facility. You know, it's right across from apartments, and a lot of the complaints here are about the noise at night from what's happening out there. Who has the authority to move a federal building like that? Is that an option in this case?
Well, it is an option, but not a near-term option. If the facility was just to shut down, then the folks who are brought to that facility would instead be taken directly to Tacoma. I heard from the lawyers who support those who are being detained that it would be much harder for them to gain access and present themselves to, well, even to find out where their potential client had been taken, let alone be able to get in and be able to provide legal advice. So it's valuable to the defense of due process to have a facility nearby, but I certainly wish it wasn't in downtown Portland.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Senator Jeff Merkley, really appreciate your time this morning on this really important topic. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for reporting on it and being right down there on the waterfront to do so. Well done.
Thank you.